articulating or describing what I mean and Grant Wiggins and I mean by backward design. First of all, this is not a new idea. One of my heroes, Dr. Ralph Tyler, wrote a book in 1949 on the basics of curriculum. And in it, he posed three questions. What do we want students to learn? How will we know they've learned it? And what will we do to help them learn it? And those three questions essentially embody what Grant Wiggins and I have described as three stages of backward design. And so just summarize, stage one is where we identify goals or desired results or outcomes for learning. Stage two, for me, is at the heart of the process because stage two asks teachers or curriculum designers to think like assessors rather than teachers. Thinking like an assessor asks this question: if these are my goals, what evidence will show that students have attained them? And that question precedes the question of stage three of backward design, which is how am I going to teach and what learning experiences will help students achieve the outcomes and meet the assessments or do well in the assessments. So that's the essence of backward design. I have found it to be an exceptionally practical but also effective process for lots of things, but notably in this case, curriculum design. In our book, Understanding by Design, Grant Wiggins and I refer to the, quote, twin sins of teaching and curriculum planning, and both of them are well-intentioned. One of the, quote, twin sins we described as activity-oriented curriculum. And in my experience, that's especially common with teachers of younger children. And it's well-intentioned in that they want to engage the learners in something interesting, active, enjoyable, perhaps. And so that's all to be celebrated. However, what we see often, or sometimes at least, is there might be an engaging learning activity, but it's not clear what its purpose is. There's no evidence of what the students have learned from it other than they were engaged. And so the question becomes, toward what end? The second twin sin is something that we refer to as coverage. A coverage orientation tends, in my experience, to be more prominent with older students, secondary or high school and collegiate, college, university level. And it's not surprising that there is so much content in various subject area courses. And often teachers and students are working from large textbooks with volumes of information. And so a well-intentioned teacher of biology or physics or English literature, for example, wants to cover it all or feels compelled to cover it all. And with all due respect, I don't believe that's the goal of teaching and learning. If your goal is to cover lots of content, then you can talk faster in class and you'll get through it. But that's not likely to result in deep or lasting learning. Interestingly, both of those, quote, twin sins, which again, well-intentioned, activity-oriented teaching and coverage-oriented teaching, suffer from, I believe, the same lapse or misconception. And that is, A, if I teach it, they will have learned it. If I cover it, I've done my job. Or if I engage students in activities and they're engaged, I've done my job. What's missing in both cases is A, clarity about the learning outcomes to be achieved and or priority. A teacher can say, I've got this entire book to cover in one year of schooling, but not all the content in that book is of equal value. Not all the content in that book necessarily matches up with the desired outcomes or content standards. And similarly with the activity-oriented teaching and curriculum planning, students can engage in activities but not derive much from it. So it's a lack of clarity of outcomes, a lack of prioritizing of the content, number one. And number two, in both of those cases, there's a good chance that there's not sufficient or appropriate assessment evidence to answer the question, what did students learn and gain from this activity or am I covering all this content? So backward design, to go back to your first question, can help address those two potential problems where they exist. If teachers really understand backward design and apply it to their planning and their curriculum design and their teaching and their assessment, they're going to have greater clarity about the outcomes, a sense of priority about what's most important for kids to learn, and the right evidence that will answer the question, what did they get from my activity or my coverage? Now, I'm going to throw in another riff here. There's a third sin that is evident in some countries, and I can certainly highlight the US and some others I know, and that is with the increase of high stakes accountability testing, the third sin I would characterize as test prep. And I have seen this both in the US and in other countries. The worst case of test prep is where teachers either believe and or are told they should only focus on the content that's going to be tested. If it's not on the standardized or accountability test, it doesn't count or it's not important. To me, that's a more serious systemic flaw when the accountability system is so strong that those messages are conveyed to teachers or they believe it. Here's a simple example. In English language arts or any language, there are listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and arguably research skills to be developed. But most large-scale standardized tests, at least in my experience, don't do an adequate job, if any job, of assessing listening or speaking. And the assessments of reading and writing are sometimes done through indirect proxies. And so to say we're only going to focus our curriculum and our teaching on that tested area in language arts undercuts really the underpinnings of literacy, right? Listening and speaking are the underpinnings of reading and writing. The fact that it's not on an accountability test in no way should mean we don't have to worry about it. On the contrary, if we want to build literate people, we should be working on listening, speaking, as well as reading, writing in authentic ways. There's an analogy that I'm fond of in this regard. Now, if you're familiar with sailboats, sailboat has an important part that's not visible above the surface of the water. It's the keel. The keel is below the boat, but the keel serves an important function at helping the boat stay on course when currents shift or when strong winds are otherwise pushing it. To me, there are elements of the keel for curriculum, for learning outcomes or standards, and for assessments. And my experience is if you can get the keel right, that will help education stay on course, even in the face of shifting political winds and currents. So let me start with terminology. Sometimes I think terms get in the way in our profession, but to me the most important thing is that a group, whether it's a nation or a school, identifies terms they're going to use, defines them, and uses them consistently. With respect to the terms outcomes and outputs, here's my kind of general conception. Outcomes refer to the goals that we are after for learning. Outputs refer to what students actually can do or demonstrate. And let me unpack each of those a little more specifically. In our framework of understanding by design, Grant Wiggins and I propose, broadly speaking, or categorically speaking, 3 kinds of learning goals. They're not new, they're interrelated, but they're not identical. So one learning goal type we'll call knowledge. And I'm defining that as essentially factual knowledge or basic concepts that someone can remember over time. There are skills that are procedural in nature that define what we want students to be able to do. And skills, you could range skills from very basic skills or very simple skills to more complex processes like critical thinking or problem solving or argumentation. but they're procedural in nature. So those are two goal types, and we call them acquisition goals, especially basic skills, not the more advanced processes. So we want students to acquire knowledge and skills, and every subject, every discipline has them. Second category are what we call understanding goals. An understanding goal is about a more abstract and transferable idea, typically a concept, a principle, LE, or a process. And if you even think of a basic process of writing, there are conceptual understandings that underlie what effective writers understand and can apply. The third goal type, which we like to highlight because we don't think it's often identified, is transfer. Transfer, as you know, is the ability to take what one has learned and effectively and appropriately apply it to something they haven't seen before. Now, we can think about near-term and far-term transfer. Near-term might be, as an example, with young children, they're learning addition and they're learning with marbles. And then you give them apples. Can they do the same process? That's a pretty near-term transfer, but it's nonetheless illustrative of where the student understands division, if they can make the switch. A far transfer might be looking at a concept like adaptability and looking at how it applies in cellular biology or in human systems. That's a far transfer. My contention is a modern education should ultimately be preparing students to transfer their learning within disciplines and across disciplines. For the straightforward reason we know. Knowledge continues to grow. We cannot cover everything there is to cover in various fields. And some fields like history and science are growing daily. The world is changing and it's unpredictable. Rote learning will not prepare students or people for navigating unpredictable circumstances. Rote learning will allow you to give back what was told in the way it was told. So my argument is the best preparation for modern learning is to give kids lots of opportunities to learn deeply such that they can transfer. Let me give a quick analogy of those three goal types using driving as an example. So if you're teaching someone to drive, or any of the viewers of this video who have children at that learn to drive phase, you'll get this. When you think about teaching someone to drive, there's knowledge they have to acquire. The meaning of the colored lights on the traffic light, or the rules and regulations for driving in their city or in Wales. There are skills, lots of skills that have to be practiced. The relationship of the brake and the accelerator is an important one. You got to master that. So we can identify knowledge and skills for driving. But there are also conceptual understandings. An example, at least one that the term I use is defensive driving. Defensive driving is a big idea. It's not a fact, and it's more than just a skill. It's an understanding that you may be safe and practiced and attentive behind the wheel, but you're sharing the road with other people who may do dangerous or unexpected things. So defensive driving is a concept, and you have to be constantly vigilant to the actions of others. That's a big idea. And there are others that we could identify for driving. Transfer. If we're teaching young people to drive and we're giving them a license to drive essentially a lethal weapon, what as a society are our goals in teaching and licensing drivers? And you could identify what I would call the long-term transfer goals in ways such as we want to develop people who are safe, defensive, adaptable, courteous drivers who are able to benefit both personally and societally from transportation using a motor vehicle. One might say, well, isn't that obvious, that those last goals? And my answer is perhaps, in fact, they probably are, but let's keep the end in mind. Let's recognize that it's not just about do they know the rules and regulations and can pass a written test, or even can they go out on a 20-minute driving test or park the car appropriately. You can master knowledge and skills without having understanding or transfer. So to summarize, all three goals are important. They exist in every discipline. They exist across disciplines with things like critical thinking or creativity or the ability to work with others. And so planning with the end in mind, backward design, means let's be mindful of all those goal types. So when I talk about outcomes, I'm talking about those three types. Why do these distinctions matter? Clarity about goal types matters to me for two reasons. One, students learn these things in not identical ways. If I want a student to remember something, I can give them a mnemonic, I can have them write it 10 times, I can have them repeat it, and it's going to get into their memory, especially when they use it. If I want to see if a student really, if I want to develop understanding in a student about a more complex, big idea like defensive driving, I've got to use different teaching methods than just, do it 3 times. Through Socratic questioning, through application and feedback, through having them study examples of defensive driving versus not, we're going to build, coming to understand is a phrase that means something. It occurs over time, and it is constructed in the mind of the learner. Similarly, clarity about those goal types matters for assessment. If I want to see if students know something, as in the ability to get the right answer or remember something, an objective test or quiz will tell me that. But if I want to see if students really understand and can apply their learning, I need more of a performance-based measure to really gauge that. So to summarize, these 3 goal types, again, are not new. They're interrelated, but the clarity among them is important for both teaching, learning, and assessment. One important question for assessment is, how do we know students really understand the most important ideas and processes which we want them to understand and which are necessary for transfer? And so a big part of understanding by design is around that question. And a short version answer is, and I'll lay it out as a question: how do we know students understand? What are the indicators of understanding? How do students differ between a student who really has a deep understanding of a concept or process versus a student who may know things but has a superficial understanding of that content or that topic? And we have a whole theory about evidence of understanding, indicators of understanding, that we've referred to as different facets. The short version of my answer to that question, what is understanding and what do we look for as indicators or evidence of it, is students need to do 2 things to demonstrate their understanding. One, they have to be able to apply their learning to something that's somewhat new, something they haven't seen before, thus they can't just give a rote response. And secondly, they have to be able to explain what they've done and explain it, what they've done, show their work, justify their answer, support their argument. It's the twin processes of application and explanation that will give us evidence of understanding. A student may be able to apply something, but if they can't explain what they did or why they did it, we think their understanding is incomplete. Or they may be able to give an explanation theoretically, but they can't apply it to a real world situation. Grant Wiggins and I like to propose a judicial analogy to the question, how do we judge understanding? We're going to presume the student is innocent of understanding until convicted by a preponderance of evidence. And that evidence, in my view, involves application and explanation. If one buys that argument or that conception, it has immediate and direct implications for the kinds of assessments we need if we want to see if students understand and can apply their learning. If all we care about is, do they remember stuff or do they have very basic skills, we can use traditional tests with single correct answers. So it's an if-then proposition. If you say you value understanding and transfer, your assessments need to provide that evidence, along with more traditional assessments of knowledge and skill acquisition. I am an unapologetic proponent of including performance-based assessments as part of an assessment system. Performance-based assessments simply mean we're going to ask students to, quote, perform with their learning. We're going to ask them to apply their learning to some situation or problem or issue or context. As much as possible, we want to create authentic or relevant contexts for their application, in part so students see reasons for learning things and to see how learning is in fact applied in real life circumstances. So given that, there are reasonable and psychometrically sound ways of potentially differentiating performance tasks for students. I mean, a simple example would be if you're assessing students' understanding of a science concept, you might do it in writing, but you could do it where the student does a visual representation with an oral explanation. Similarly, we have an acronym that we use in Understanding by Design called GRASPS. And it's just a framework for developing authentic tasks. So the G is for the goal for the student. Example, your job is to advise a homeowner on whether this proposal for a renovation is sound. And they have to do calculations and so on to do that. Or you're entertaining a young reader by creating a modern day fable to illustrate a moral precept, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a goal for the learner. The R is a role. Now, sometimes that's simulated. Imagine you're an architect, or imagine you are a science researcher validating an experiment, or imagine you're yourself teaching a younger child to do something. So you give them a role, real or imaginary. The A of GRASPS refers to audience. One of the ways we make school like the world outside of school is that people work with an audience, with a client, with a purpose. So the GR and A are those elements. The S of GRASP, the first S, refers to the situation or the context, again, as realistic as possible. The P of GRASP refers to what will students make or do to demonstrate their learning, show their understanding. So the P could be products, written, visual, three-dimensional like a model, or actual performances where they get up and do a monologue or deliver a TED Talk or demonstrate physically some skill. And then the final S refers to the success criteria. In other words, how are we going to judge what students do? They should know this as they're working on a performance task. My reason for bringing that up is that's not only a useful acronym for building authentic tasks, but it can be used for differentiation when appropriate. You can give students a different role, potentially a different audience, and potentially a different product or performance, and if you're careful, can still get the evidence you need given your outcome. Here's another quick example. There's a performance task for nutrition where the student has to explain healthy, balanced eating, as well as health problems that might result from poor nutrition. A simple version of that task is you are yourself, and your job is to create a picture book to teach young children, show them what healthy, balanced eating is, and to illustrate potential health problems from poor nutrition. Another version would be you're a nutrition expert creating a brochure to be placed in supermarket checkouts. Your audience are adults. Now, the goals are the same. Show that you understand healthy, balanced eating and problems of nutritionally related health problems. The audience, product, and roles are differentiated. Now, some might say, well, wait a minute, wouldn't a written brochure be harder than a picture book? And my answer is, No, you're looking for evidence of nutrition. This is not a writing class or an art course. You might have secondary criteria related to how colorful your brochure is or whether you spelled your words correctly in your brochure. But if it's a nutrition goal, we could differentiate and still get evidence. So that's a way of honoring student differences, interests, talents, while still getting the evidence we need if we use backward design properly. Because backward design says you need to be clear about your goal, clear about the kind of evidence you need, and within that, you can often adjust, differentiate to support learners. The goal is not everybody doing the same thing in the same way. The goal is getting evidence that's appropriate that allows proper inference. That especially when you're helping kids learn, there's an appropriate role for scaffolding for students. So the simple example is if we're having students write an argumentation essay or an argumentation paper, students that really understand argumentation can do it. But for kids who are learning or are struggling with it, we could give them an organizer that says, I have a table organizer, for example. The top of the table is your claim, and we talk about what a claim is. The legs of the table are your reasons that support your claim. At the bottom of each leg, there's a clawfoot. That's the evidence that undergirds your reasons to support your claim. So you would give them a table organizer, you teach it, and then you'd say, now, as you're building your argument, let's start. Is your claim clear? Are your reasons sound? Are they grounded in proper and appropriate evidence? Et cetera. And that, to me, would be an important scaffolding, particularly for students that might be struggling with something as challenging as argumentation writing. Now, if it's a high-stakes assessment, then you might say, well, we want to see what the student can do on their own. So we wouldn't give them that scaffold. But in our teaching of argumentation, we absolutely would. But with the idea that we're going to drop off the scaffolds once the student has mastered the idea or become proficient with the process. If I were looking at a national curriculum reform or innovation, I would bring together experts in the content areas to flesh out stage one of backward design. What are the key transfer goals in every discipline? And those are few and far between. They're not too many, and I'm sure they're articulated already. But I wouldn't let that be up to individual teachers. Secondly, I would identify the big ideas, the understandings associated with various topics or skills in the discipline, and concurrently develop related overarching essential questions. This is where content expertise really matters. Even teachers that may have the time and the interest don't always have the expertise to do that well. And so to me, clarity about outcomes is derived not only from the outcomes or the standards, but those elements that I just mentioned. I wouldn't leave that up to individual teachers. Now, having said that, let me be a little more precise. In the essential questions I'm referencing are open-ended, thought-provoking questions that are meant to be explored again and again. And I would argue, or I do argue, for overarching essential questions that would be developed by a team of experts in the various disciplines. Let me give you a few examples. How do effective writers hook and hold their readers? What do effective problem solvers do when they get stuck? Whose story is this in history? To what extent is the medium the message in art and media? These are rich, important questions. There are not that many of them. There might be 10, 20 for a discipline, but they're important questions. They're meant to be explored across the grades, and they bring clarity and focus to the content because they focus on developing and deepening understanding of big ideas. So as part of a curriculum framework, you present this to teachers. Here are the long-term transfer goals we're working toward. Like I said in example for driving. Here are the really big ideas that we want to teach for understanding. And here are companion essential questions that will help you teach that way. You can always take the questions and fine-tune them, make them more kid-friendly, or make them more topic-specific to the topics you're teaching, which is a good move by teacher. That's a teacher design move. But you're not having to come up with them on your own. You could decide how much specificity you want in the knowledge and skills. But typically, curriculum documents specify what students should know and do. From an assessment point of view, we want to, A, be assessing everything we claim to value, not just the things that are easiest to test and measure. If we agree that there are important goals of understanding and transfer goals, not just knowledge and skills acquisition, it makes the case for including performance-based assessments in our photo album of evidence, in addition to more traditional tests and measures. One of the most impactful professional learning experiences came when teachers got together in small groups to look at student work on performance tasks against well-developed rubrics, because they're doing more than just, quote, scoring or evaluating what students do. They're getting insight into what students are doing well, but also where they are weak. And one of the most beneficial aspects of teachers looking at student work or scoring student work in teams was what happened after the session. They would talk about, well, how are you teaching this? Because my kids are having the same problem. They would share ideas and resources for addressing the weak areas. My contention has come to be that's the heart of improving educational performance by students. Not a once a year standardized snapshot where the results are published in the papers and poor performing schools are sanctioned or otherwise embarrassed, but looking at student work on a more regular basis by teams of teachers, and not just scoring it, but analyzing what the weaknesses are and how they're going to improve. Here's another analogy, since I'm fond of these. Think about athletics. How do coaches of athletic teams improve the performance of their players? And coming off World Cup, we can use football as the example. In my experience, coaches would study game film, analyze what the team did well, where the weaknesses were, and that's what they work on in subsequent practices. That is an athletic version of a professional learning community, a PLC. If we have a system of performance assessment tasks and well-developed rubrics, and we can agree on a schedule, even if it's only 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, where teachers come together, where the students are off for a day, and the teachers look at student work in teams, and not only score it, but share their insights about what are we going to do in practice next week, metaphorically speaking. That's how we improve performance. It's a photo album model of assessment. It's a system that includes assessments of all valued outcomes through performance-based measures, not just easiest to test on proxy tests. And it's involving teachers in the analysis of student work. By no means do I think this is an easy shift to make, but I think it's the right shift if it could be engineered. And it seems to me that Wales is in a position of transforming its curriculum assessment system such that this could be a possibility. I would love to, nothing more than to see this happening some ways where I can now point to Wales and say, look, it can be done here. Not surprisingly, sometimes confusion between types and purposes of assessment. That's very common in the US and Australia and Canada and elsewhere where I've worked. So I want to give a few thoughts on that. For me, there are fundamentally 3 purposes for classroom assessments. There's diagnostic purpose, where before you start teaching something, you want to find out what kids know or think they know, or check their skill level if it's a skill-based outcome. And we know that it's so important that the most significant factor in learning something new is prior knowledge. So before you start layering on new information or new learning on a student, you ought to find out what they know or think they know. And we know, especially in science, there's a large research base that shows that often students come into science, particularly physical science, with naive conceptions or preconceptions that are wrong. And there's been interesting studies done that even with good teaching, those misconceptions persist. If you don't know they're there, you might find out on your final test. So diagnostic assessment helps teachers know where students are, which gives them impact or information on starting place and also needed differentiation. If that half the class already knows a concept and the other doesn't, differentiation is in order. Then there's formative or ongoing assessment, sometimes referred to as assessments for learning. And the purpose of these are they're ongoing assessments, they're part of teaching, and their purpose is to inform, hence the name formative. They inform the teacher of what's working and what's not. I taught a great lesson, but then I realized only a third of the students got the big idea. I need to revisit that. That's information for the teacher. And formative assessments provide information to the students. Jay, you're using the same phrase again and again in your writing. Or you're confusing numerator and denominator when you're dividing fractions. That's feedback. And if the student wants to improve, they need feedback, which is specific information from formative assessments. One of the key tensions that I see often is that teachers want to grade formative assessments. And my view is, don't do that. Formative assessments are not for the evaluation purpose, they're for the information purpose. And that leads to the third type of classroom assessments, which are often called summative, but I actually prefer the term evaluative, because summative kind of refers to when they occur, sort of in summation toward the end. And that may very well be, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is to evaluate. And for teachers that have to give grades, grades come from evaluative assessments, and there's a place for that. Going back to the athletic analogy, you might see, Saturday's game as the summative evaluative assessment, and the scores will go in the paper. But it's the scrimmage that occurs in practice that's the formative assessment that's preparatory for the game. We're not going to grade or score the scrimmage. We're going to use it for feedback to help improve that will hopefully turn up in the evaluative assessments. So that's a long way of saying clarity about those purposes informs practice. And there is a lot of confusion. People tend to lump a number of things under the heading of assessment, but they're not all equal. The first page has 3 columns with a question at the top of each. Column 1, what are the learning goals or outcomes? And that's where I've specified those different kinds of outcomes: knowledge, skill, understanding, transfer, habits of mind. The second and third column are related. What's the purpose for these assessments? And who's the audience? And what information do they need? And so you can look at different purposes for assessment, everything from diagnostic, formative, purposes like for program selection, like university placement or placement in classes at high school, or accountability. You can list all the purposes. And the audiences include everything from the teacher, the student, the parent, the employer, the university, the state. And so the first part of the framework is you have to answer those 3 questions. What's the content, the outcomes you're assessing? For what purpose or purposes? And who is the primary audience or audiences, and what information do they need? The second page of the framework looks at a whole array of methods, from selected response tests to brief constructed response to more authentic performance tasks to projects. And even we call them process-oriented assessments, like this teacher just talking with a student or making observations. The choice of assessment methods is directly linked to the answer to the first three questions. What are you assessing? What's your purpose? Who's your audience? And the third page of the framework looks at evaluation methods and communication methods. And communication methods include everything from letter grades, percentiles, rankings, rubric scores, etc. So once again, you want to match your communication methods all the way back to what you're assessing, for what purpose, and for whom, and based on the assessment methodology that you use to gather evidence. It's proven to be a really robust planning system, whether you're looking at a teacher planning for his or her assessment or a national assessment system. Yeah, and so if the parent says, well, I want scores on my child from a national assessment, I would say we can give you a score, but it's not going to help you understand what you're after. Here are better ways to get the information you need versus an employer or a university admissions officer or a policymaker. Here's what we can give you. Here's how that information can be used. And here's where it's inappropriately used or not appropriate evidence. Because sometimes people conflate a score, right, with, they think it means more than it does.